Welcome to the Psychology World podcast. I'm Connor Whiteley, bringing you psychology news, articles, and other interesting psychology-related articles. Where I can find the podcast notes and more interesting psychology-related things, and you can get your free 8 psychology book box set at connorwhiteley.net. Now let's get on to the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 133 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on why dementia is not a diagnosis. And it is Saturday, the 12th of February 2022, as I record this. So today's episode is a really very unusual, very interesting podcast episode though, because most of the listeners of this podcast are psychology students and psychology professionals. And I think this is a really interesting topic for all of us, especially those of us that study clinical psychology. Because in short, if you study clinical psychology, then we are all aware of the argument that diagnosis is actually quite a rubbish tool, and instead there should be other stuff to replace it. And off the top of my head, I cannot remember what people want to change it to. But as soon as this podcast finishes, I'll remember it for sure. Probably 7 or 9 when that happens. So in this episode, we're actually going to start applying that thinking towards dementia, because as we've spoken about before on previous dementia podcast episodes, dementia is not a diagnosis in itself, it's an umbrella term. But now I really want to dive into this in a bit more depth, and this is such a fascinating episode that I really enjoyed it. Hopefully you will too. So, moving on to the psychology news section, we're reading from the British Psychological Society Researchers Digest, and there's some quite interesting ones. There were quite a few, but I've managed to narrow it down to 3. That was quite hard. Okay, so, does the VR give you motion sickness? Try chewing some gum. VR headsets are becoming commonplace, not only in entertainment and pilot training, but in clinical settings, in helping people to overcome phobias, for example, or to distract burn patients whilst their dressings are changed. Unfortunately, there's a common side effect, visually induced motion sickness, sometimes also known as cyber sickness. This limits the use of VR, or means that people have to spend extended periods of time feeling nauseated whilst they adapt to it. But according to a new paper in experimental brain research, there's a very simple way to tackle this problem: chewing flavoured gum. And the reason why I actually wanted to talk about this was quite simply because VR, AR and metaverse, which is slowly starting to catch up in a technological development, will only become more prevalent in our society and also in our lives. And yes, people are thinking that it's a joke at the moment, because of course these technological shifts that I've been monitoring will completely change the way that we live. But it's always important to keep looking at how these new tools can actually interact with a patient and can actually help us in improve mental health of other people. So it's really good that we are starting to use more VR headsets in clinical settings, and it's also good that we're actually finding ways to actually help people manage with them, so that we can hopefully apply this more and more if it's appropriate. And the second one is, offenders feel like victims when their victims don't forgive them. Forgiveness is not always easy. Forgiving someone who has wronged you can lead to a decreased likelihood of repeat offending and increased likelihood that the perpetrator will engage in conciliatory behaviour, reconciling behaviour. Just some of the reasons restorative justice has become popular, but victims of transgressions often find it hard to move on. A study published in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin looks at what happens when victims don't forgive and forget, and specifically how this makes offenders feel. The team finds that, if not offered forgiveness, those who have committed transgressions end up feeling like victims too. When I first read this, I didn't understand it, but after looking over it, I do understand it now, because basically what it's saying is that if the wronggiver isn't given forgiveness, then they feel wronged and they feel like victims too, because the person who they've wronged hasn't offered them forgiveness. And that's how it plays out. So very interesting. And of course, forgiveness. It is impossible to forgive everyone all the time. That, and I definitely think that this sort of psychology news article, it's easier said than done. And to be honest, this is more like a food for thought rather than a practical advice. But of course, these articles are still important because it helps us to deepen our understanding. And the last one is, we feel more disgusted by people who don't share our political views. Our politics play a significant role in the way we interact with others. We can be dismissive or intolerant of those with different politics to us, and research from 2020 even found that we prefer strangers who share our political attitudes to actual friends that don't, and I think I covered that Psychology News article before. New research published in Personality and the Social Psychology Bulletin finds that this dislike can go beyond mere intolerance. The team finds that we can even feel a physical disgust towards members of political outgroups, with potential repercussions to how we treat our political rivals. So even though this is never, and this will never be, a political show, I still really like to cover political psychology topics, because of course politics is really interesting, and of course politics is definitely becoming a lot more, political behaviours, I definitely feel in the past 5 years are definitely becoming a lot easier to see, because of course we've had so much political polarisation, and of course conspiracy theories. And on Twitter I follow one of my professors, Professor Karen Douglas, and she's all about conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theories really do interact with politics, so it's really interesting. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this one is that because this week I've been out quite a bit, seeing friends and family, and it's really interesting to actually talk to other family members who don't share my politics, and to be honest, quite how dismissive they can actually be there. So I just wanted to mention it, because I just wanted to say that just be respectful, but just be respectful, be kind to their face, and then if you really need it, then I can just moan about them later to someone else. So I just thought I'd share those 3 articles. So I hope you enjoyed the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. So this week has really been focusing on my psychology placement, and to be honest, it's actually turned out to be really, really interesting though, because I know that I've spoken on the podcast before about my mobile mental health review, and I'm pretty sure, and I know that we did some more stuff on that, but I can't actually remember. But I do want to give a massive kudos, well done, congratulations to all of the psychology professionals and the students that have to look for journals to pitch to, or journals to submit to. I really do not know how you do it, because I ended up doing it, and I found out 20, and I learned so much, just from those 2 hours. Because for people who don't know, so the 3 main metrics when you look for when it comes to finding journals to submit to is of course relevance, something called a Q1 journal, which no one told me what it was, so I actually had to Google it. And a Q1 journal means that the journal was in the top 25% of the journals, and it basically means that it's a very prestigious journal, that and it's of good quality. And then the third and final factor, which I had absolutely no idea was even considered, is what's known as an impact factor. So what this means is that it's basically the average amount of citations all of the journal articles published in that journal have been over the past 2 years. And basically, the higher the number, the more better the journal is. So if you've ever had to take part in a search for journals, I really do commend you. So I had to do that, and then what I also had to do was that now I'm going through about 1,000 odd academic papers, papers that were for another literature review, and I'm basically trying to find out the weaknesses. Some of them are just funny though, because of what it's on is that it's on a autistic serious game literature review, and the funny thing about that is that some of the studies, they have 4 participants, and they're calling that a scientific study. And I'm like, no, because basically, how do you apply the results from 4 people to an entire population of autistic individuals? It doesn't work like that. No population does. So it's really good. So it would definitely be interesting to actually go into the literature more and actually write it up though. Yeah, definitely be interesting. So, as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So, you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment at the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi-whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you, because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And today's episode has been sponsored by Cognitive Psychology, a guide to neuroscience, neuropsychology, and cognitive psychology, 3rd edition. So this is an absolutely brilliant book that I cannot recommend enough, because not only does it go into mental processes like thinking, memory, decision making in a lot of great, really easy to understand depth, but it also goes into stuff like semantic dementia, which of course we've not covered yet on the podcast. So I really do recommend it, because if you really want to understand how our cognition and how our mental processes affect our behaviour, then this book is a really great guide to actually help you. That, and it really does build upon these dementia-focused episodes in a really great, easy to understand way. So that is it, Cognitive Psychology, a guide to neuroscience, neuropsychology, and cognitive psychology, 3rd edition, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore, and local library if you request it. And if you enjoyed today's episode, but you don't want to buy a book, then you can also show the podcast a bit of love. Buy me a coffee for a bit of one-time support at buymeacoffee.com/Conor Whiteley. So let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about why dementia isn't a diagnosis. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this topic is because no one thinks about it, and I am certainly no exception whatsoever. And then another reason why we need to talk about this is because if we just stop at dementia as the diagnosis, then the dementia sufferer cannot get the professional help they need. And what makes this really interesting is actually how this relates to other areas of our psychology too. So that's what I'm actually going to talk about now. So on the past dementia-focused podcast episodes, we've spoken about the different types of dementia and how they differ. Each one has its own causes, symptoms, and possible treatment options to some extent, as well as dementia is just an umbrella term for a whole range of different mental health conditions. Therefore, if anyone just says that someone has dementia, then this can be extremely dangerous, as it can stop them from getting professional help and seeking a real diagnosis to find out what condition they actually have. And this is even more important when we realise that several conditions copy the symptoms of dementia, and they have similar impacts on behaviour, hence the interest to psychology. Not only does it allow people to understand the type of dementia they have, but it allows us to understand what aspects of our cognition and behaviour are likely to be affected first, and those that are likely to be affected later. So by getting a specific diagnosis, it allows us to plan more effectively with a treatment and the support, but expectations too. Another way to think about this is saying now that someone has a headache. Due to headaches, it can be caused by an entire range of things like stress and migraines, as well as they can be caused by a range of diseases which can be a lot more serious, like brain tumours and strokes. And this is why it's always critical to get a professional diagnosis. And then if we apply this to clinical psychology more generally, this is why a diagnosis is always important for all mental health conditions. For example, people could believe that a child is awful, badly behaved and antisocial, but they might have autism, and without the diagnosis we wouldn't know, and we wouldn't know how to get access to the brilliant range of support and interventions that could be used to help the child cope with everyday life and thrive as a result. Importance of checking and of reversible causes of dementia. Another reason to check for dementia and to get a real diagnosis is because it is critical to check for reversible causes of dementia. And this is another reason why I love learning about dementia, because I had absolutely no idea whatsoever that dementia even had reversible causes, meaning that the dementia can be gotten rid of. With some of these reversible causes including B12 deficiency, hypothyroidism, chronic infections like in Lyme disease. All of these conditions and the causes can be easily detected by blood tests. So after a diagnosis has been reached, these tests can be conducted, and hopefully, if the causes are reversible, then a treatment program can be arranged and the dementia can be gotten rid of. Right, also though, we will look at this in another podcast episode, but depression is another potential cause to bear in mind. In addition, by using a structural brain imaging, doctors can identify subdural hematomas, which are accumulations of blood between the skull and brain, brain, and other rather horrific sounding abnormalities that need to be removed to relieve brain pressure or help prevent strokes. Overall, it's important to get a real dementia diagnosis so that people can understand the type of dementia they have, so treatment options can be developed, even if it is sadly just options to slow down the dementia, as well as it gives people a chance to see if their dementia is reversible. And that one, I really, really wished that my great uncle even had that option, that it could even be reversible. More on treatments for dementia. So throughout the podcast episode, I've rather heavily hinted at the main reason why getting a right diagnosis is important is for treatment options, since it is only with the right diagnosis that can the sufferer get the correct treatment for them. For example, and I swear that when I do these blog posts, I actually hate my inability to actually pronounce these properly. I've actually got to start looking at them up before podcast recording. Okay then. So for example, chlorine estin inhibitors that can improve patients with Alzheimer's, dementia with Lewy bodies, and vascular dementia. Stroke workup and treatment is necessary for vascular dementia, and it is normally used as aspirin or other blood thinners. Surgical evaluation and possible intervention is needed for people with normal pressure hydrocephalus, a buildup of a spinal fluid inside the brain, or subdural hematoma. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which of course, as we all know, is very famous in clinical psychology, are used as the first line of defense and first therapy for treating frontotemporal dementia. Then, of course, don't forget about medical trials or studies looking at new treatments for dementia. And of course, none of this is ever official advice, but there are some great studies going on for dementia. And I'm pretty sure that my placement supervisor is always working on one. Therefore, if you and the dementia sufferer are interested in that sort of stuff, then go for it. Explore the area, and you will never know, you might have helped dementia science to take another step forward. Why does this apply to psychology students and professionals? Conclusion. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast episode, I know that this podcast is made up mainly of amazing psychology students and psychology professionals, and this is whom I always create my content for. But I wouldn't blame you in the slightest for wondering, why am I telling you about the importance of a diagnosis, since it is a fundamental principle in clinical psychology. But I did this episode for two main reasons that might not be clear to us, but they're critical for our clients and the people we serve. Firstly, don't give our clients a general diagnosis like a dementia, because at the end of the day, that general diagnosis is useless to them. Give them the full details so they can truly understand what is happening to them, and maybe they can start to do something about it. Of course, that last bit isn't always apply, but you will get the idea, as well as it will help them to understand why a psychotherapy or another course of action is needed. Secondly, deepen our understanding. I still love clinical psychology because there is always something more to learn, and for all of us, deepening our understanding and learning about where people are coming from is critical. So by learning why dementia isn't a good diagnosis, we can inform our own practice and learn how to treat our current or future clients better. And learning more about clinical psychology never hurts, does it? Overall, but dementia is a great topic that has as many facets as other mental health conditions. So it is important to focus on from time to time. But remember, the most important takeaway from this episode is don't settle for a dementia diagnosis. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope that you got something out of it. So I always really enjoy learning about dementia, and that's why it is a major focus for the podcast in 2022. So if you know someone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And definitely check out Cognitive Psychology, a guide to neuroscience, neuropsychology, and cognitive psychology, 3rd edition, available from all of the usual places. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the show notes, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. And if you want a free 8-book psychology box set, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.